All right, so we are going to be reviewing the simple to-do list challenge first. How did people find this challenge? Was it intuitive, non-intuitive?
The local storage part was cold.
Yeah. I think that was yeah. The local storage part is probably a fun twist on this challenge. So, especially because when we're doing this, we're essentially using, for this challenge, we're using local storage in a way that it really wasn't intended to be used, but it is doable. In the future, if you make another to-do list, which you very well might, you probably want to hook it up to some kind of back-end database of some sort. Like if you ever wanted to, like, hooking it up to, like, say, a Firebase server would probably be very simple. But since the challenge calls for us to use local storage, that's what we're going to do today. Open this up. So right now we just have the README. Let's take a look at it. So it's got some very vague steps for us. Create your HTML, CSS, and JS files. Display a list of items that you need to do. Use local storage to get and remove these items. Create a form at the bottom of the list. Add more things to your to-do list. Create the ability to check off things from your to-do list. When you check things off, make sure that that has a strike through so that you know what you've already done. Those will probably alter the data structure you have in local storage. And then finally, style it. Use Bootstrap in addition to vanilla CSS. All right, so let's just start off with that first step. Create your HTML, CSS, and JS files. That we can do. So I'm going to touch index.html. What is this? The standard renderer for the integrated terminal appears to be slow on your computer. I'm just going to hold off on this. I don't know what it is. I'm going to create, I'll call this styles.css and call this one script.js. And I've got this handy dandy shortcut here. Let me just get an entire HTML framework in just 2 keystrokes. To-do list. Going to make sure it is linked up with my CSS and JS files. So say this one is styles.cs, CSS, and get a script tag for my JavaScript file. src equals script.js, and then we need async and defer so we don't have any DOM rendering issues. All right, so that's one step out of the way. Let's keep this up here. Display a list of items that you need to do. So let's think a bit about, all right, what are we going to need in the HTML file? What components, off the top of our head, are we going to do, like, would help us with this? We're going to display a list of items and then have a form for adding new ones.
2 buttons and the box where you type in items.
2 buttons. You said what buttons for what?
To add and to remove.
So we get 1 button for adding, 1 button for removing. Okay. So let's get that form out of the way. So we could say, create a form. Doesn't really need an action here because we're not actually posting or making GET requests of any kind. Let's give it an ID, like to-do form. And what is this form going to need in order to form good? Yeah, we need input. Type equals text. Let's give it like a placeholder. Equals type to do in here.
Hey,
and then we'll
Noah,
need a, yes?
what's the benefit of using a form versus just a div there?
So a form is good for getting user input. So this is for getting, so I guess we could do a, so did you mean like doing a div and then putting an input type equals text in there?
Right.
That's a good question. So when we go to our JavaScript, you know, there's a lot of event listener kinds of event listeners we can set up. And so we could have a button in a div that goes to, that triggers when we click on the submit button. But if we have a div with an input in there, and let's say we're typing something in and then we hit enter, it won't work because I believe, I may be mistaken in this, only a form can use a submit event.
I've never used a submit event.
Yeah, and so this is, and it's especially helpful for people if your user is not using a mouse. If they're just hitting tab, type, enter. That way you can get that submit event for the form, and that'll allow it to do though, as opposed to just having it trigger on a button click. So I'm also, speaking of that submit, I'm going to create a submit button though. So I'm going to open this up in my browser so that we can take a look at it. Did it work? Okay, there we go. It's being very slow. Okay, so we have a form. Let's give this just a title as well, just so it looks a little nicer. Use the H1 tag. So, you know, my to-do list. There we go. All right, so we have a form that should help us get a to-do list going in. What else do we need in order to, so it says here in our kind of what we need, what it's looking for. We also need to be able to display a list of items that we need to do. So what would be an HTML element that would be useful for displaying a list of items?
List.
Yes, a list. And we have unordered lists and ordered lists. I'd say an unordered list here makes more sense. We don't need 1, 2, 3, 4 on the side there necessarily. So I'm going to put a UL, unordered list here. Let's give it an ID equal to, you know, to-do list. And at this moment, we don't have any to-dos, so it doesn't make sense to have any LIs here, does it? But we have an unordered list here ready to catch any to-dos that we want to. All right, is there anything else that this HTML document needs at the moment?
A way to check off. Never mind.
Why never mind? Were we finish the thought?
A way to check off what was done or not. That's going to be in this item. So,
yeah. So we are going to need a way to check off items that are done, but as you said, it does make sense for that to be the responsibility of the list item. So we can click on a list item and cross it out.
what about that delete button? How would we delete something?
Well, if we take a look at our README again,
It doesn't say to me.
yeah, it says we need to create the ability to check off things from our to-do list. When we check things off, it gets a strike through, and it'll probably alter the data structure you have in local storage, but it doesn't say anything about deleting an item. Deleting an item in real time. Like maybe deleting it from the list, but not deleting it from the screen itself, from the page.
Oh, okay.
So that's the assumption I'm working off of based on the README. So essentially what my thinking is, and maybe I'm wrong about this, that when I click on an item, it gets crossed out, and then the next time I visit the page, that item isn't there anymore.
What happens if you accidentally add something into it and you like, oh, I didn't actually.
Cross it out.
Yeah, cross it out.
Oh,
And
it completed action.
yeah. Or I guess the other thing we could do is strike something through, and the next time we visit, it's still struck through. But
Oh, were we not supposed to stay struck through?
it's not really clear here.
Yeah,
So-
so, this,
Go ahead.
I was saying, this is all about being thorough in the requirements of the application. So there in the requirements, it doesn't say that it has to be deleted from the page, or it's deleted from local storage, or that back refresh it, but save, it says stay straight.
So my thinking right now is let's burn that bridge when we get to it. Because right now we have to be able to add things to our list. Once we can add things to our list, then we can worry about how to delete them. So at the moment, I think our HTML is ready enough we can actually start working on get to the work of actually making it responsive. All right, so let's pseudocode this out. At least, like, you know, in like, let's do very general steps and then worry about the specifics later. So
We started with save to local storage and load to local storage, 2 functions.
yeah, so we need a function to save items to local storage. We need a function to retrieve items from local storage. And then we need to say, like, when we submit the form, what should happen?
It should populate a list. So once you input your task in the form, submit it, it should go through the list.
So when we submit a form, what we typed should be added to the list of tasks. And it should render on the page.
Maybe we could use JSON to store our data, and because local storage is only accepting strings, right? So we can use JSON parsing for it.
All right, so
To design your data structure.
So yeah, we have a lot of like kind of weird subheaders here. So we're gonna have to think about kind of right now, really, how do we save these things in local storage since local storage can only accept text. And so JSON is a format that is designed to be converted to and from strings to data structures and vice versa. So that does actually make a lot of sense. Because if we take a look at, like, you know, go to like JavaScript, JSON, parse, let's take a look at the documentation for this. So I'm actually going to go to MDN for this one instead of W3 schools, show up some, you know, read that this is the official JavaScript document. The JSON method parses the JSON string, constructing the JavaScript value or object described by the string. So they have a string here as a result. So it's looks like a dictionary, but or an object, but it's just a string right now. When they call a JSON.parse, it gets converted into a JavaScript object, and that will also work with arrays. So they have other things here. So the brackets do an object. True turns into a Boolean true. A string, a regular string gets sent to a string. This array gets turned into an array with 1 and 5 as turned into integers. Null gets turned into null. So if we have an array, just like in regular JavaScript, we should be able to convert that to and from JSON using JSON.parse and JSON stringify is the kind of the alternate version of that. Take a look at the documentation on this, just to make sure we're reading it right. Converts a JavaScript object or value to a JSON string. If you're optionally replacing values, if your replacer function is not specified, or so we don't really need to worry about that. Okay, so we have 2 methods that should help us with retrieving and saving the data. So let's try to get this. So let's try to plan this out in greater detail. So a function to save items to local storage. So maybe we need to say define an array of tasks. Use JSON.stringify to convert into JSON string. And then set local storage dot to-dos to the JSON string. We also need to, yeah, so does that seem like a good general plan for the saving items to local storage? Cool. And retrieving items from local storage is kind of the inverse of that, right? So we'd say something like get value of local storage.todos. Use json.parse to convert into array. And honestly, that feels like, yeah, that retrieves it. So we have an idea for retrieving it from the local storage and saving it to local storage. And then when we talk about submitting on the form, what we type should be added to the list and should be rendered on the page. So we have we have two methods that we can define now, right? So we can call this one, so we could say save to-dos. It's going to take function. Do we think this function needs to take an argument? Yes or no?
Yes.
Yeah.
This function of it.
Yeah. Can take that array. Yeah. Or let's call it the to-do array. You can say, so you have to say let equal json.stringify array. Call on local storage dot set item. Set item takes two arguments. It takes a key and a value. To-dos. JSON string. So if once we have an array of to-dos, we should be able to pass it to this function and save them to local storage. We can worry about where that array is coming from later once we actually kind of get the greater architecture going. What I wanted, kind of my focus is now, is just saying, all right, I want to make sure that I have these tools ready when we need them. So same thing, we want to load the to-dos, or retrieve the to-dos. So like get to-dos. This one's not going to need an argument, I don't think. You could say, so let, kind of just do the whole thing in reverse. Local storage dot get item. Then we just say return json.parse. Oh, what am I doing? JSON string. All right. Any questions about how these two methods are going to be working? All right, cool. So let's think about.
Can you walk through them again?
Totally. So first method, save to-dos. So we're going to say at some point that we're going to pass this method an array of strings, array of tasks that we want to do. We're creating a variable called JSON string and using the json.stringify method to convert that array into a JSON string, which means it's just a string. And because it's a string, we can save it to local storage. Local storage doesn't accept data structures, it only accepts text. And then we use local storage.setItem to say, and remember, local storage works a lot like an object. So we're saying the key of to-dos is going to have the value JSON string. Then to get the to-dos, we're essentially doing it in reverse. We're saying, get me the value of the item, get me the value that's saved under the key to-dos, which is going to be a JSON string. And then we're using json.parse to convert that JSON string back into an array.
Is to-dos referring to the entire string?
So in here?
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's going to be an entire string of every to-do we have that was an array, got converted into text, and we're converting it back into an array.
What do you have if you have more than one key saved in local storage?
If we more than one key.
Let's say you wanted to track the to-do items and whether they were checked or not.
In that case, we would have to change our data structure. So, like, what would a data structure that would help us keep track of whether or not they're kept track. What kind of thing would be used to do that?
Dictionary.
Sorry?
Dictionary.
Yeah, we could use a dictionary as well. We could say something like, all right, every to-do is added to a dictionary and given like a true or false key as well, like or value as well, saying whether or not it is, if it's true, it hasn't been checked, or false either way, I guess. Depends on how you want to organize it.
How does that affect the JSON though? Get a
Good
string of 5.
What?
It doesn't.
Yeah. So we can actually kind of test this out. So we can say print, like let's say like let us call it to do dict, just to make an example here. Say like, you can call this to do research JavaScript, I don't know. And let's say it is, let's set it to false, because it isn't done. For example, then if I do print JSON.stringify to do dict.
I had no idea that JavaScript has a print function. I thought it was console log.
You're right, it is. Thank you.
Well, you can set print to equal console.log.
I could do that. Nice.
Make it easier or something.
Uh-oh. Oh, I got Todd dict instead of to do dict. Get stringified? I actually can't tell.
It's probably. Or
Yeah, it's hard to tell from this. I'm actually gonna try something else for a second. Yep, there we go. So it got converted into a string. Say JSON.parse stringified, and now we have an object. And everything that comes with it.
So the key to do wasn't referring to the to-do item.
So in this case, for local storage get item to do's is referring to some kind of data structure that we're saving there. And then once we've retrieved that data structure from local storage, then we can worry about how we're organizing that data structure. And it's not the responsibility of these particular methods to care about what the data structure looks like. All they need to do is get it, either put it into local storage or get it from local storage. Does that answer your question? Great. Cool. Get rid of this too. All right. So I guess we should probably figure out, do we want to use an array or do we want to use an object? Any thoughts on that?
object.
Yeah. Let's use an object. So we can even maybe like define a variable at the beginning to store that. So we could say something like, let's do this up here. Like so, let to do object.
I would actually argue against object because from what I've read, object doesn't guarantee the order of keys. So if you have an array, it kind of like you have a list, which is basically an ordered sequence of steps.
What we actually did was an array of objects.
Yeah, that's what that's what it is as well. Like an array of objects that would have a name key and a status key. So like or done.
Yeah, I think we could also do that. So yeah, let's try it that way. So let's to do array equals an empty array when the page first loads. And then we might need to say something like, okay, if there's something saved here in local storage, we need to do one thing. But if there isn't, we'll need to do something else. Because if we try to iterate over an array that doesn't exist, it will break. You could say something like if local storage dot get item to dos. Then we can say to do array equals get to dos. And let's leave that there for now. Then say else we want to, I don't know, what do we want to do if there isn't anything there?
We'll just initialize it, right?
Sorry?
Let's just initialize an example data so that the user can understand what's going on. So that they don't see the blank list, and we can just populate a couple of items. Eat, sleep, shower, code.
So like put something here and then have that be part of the dictionary by default, or oh. All right, so I already made,
To-do list, create to-do list.
so I do need to put this back, should put this at the bottom so we don't have any methods that we don't have access to yet. So should we just like put something in the to-do array by default right up here?
Maybe in the else statement, we can initialize it.
Okay, so like to-do array dot push, and we can say it. So name is add something to the to-do list,
Very first.
and we call it maybe done is false. So I do this and then try to check on to-do array. Got 3 items in there. Interesting. Don't know how that happened.
Did you clear out your?
Yeah, I might need to clear out.
It's one thing we had to do every time is just clear out just to make sure we get a bunch of stuff
Yeah.
up in there.
That's why it's handy to have a clear all button.
That's actually what we did. Yeah, Justin built just click and clear.
All right, so now if I look at to-do array,
So,
all right, so now I've got something here called adds link to the to-do list. All right, so that's one step done, is we have something in the to-do list ready to render if nothing was already there. So the next step would be to get it on the page, right? So take a look at our HTML again. So we have this to-do list here. Using some DOM methods, we should be able to get access to this, create a list item, and add it to this. So let's make a method for that. We call it render to-dos. And make this can also take a to-do array as an argument. Also, I also realized we have like a lot of variables called to-do array right now. And
we did that too.
but thanks to scope, it shouldn't be a problem, but it's going to be confusing if not. So I'm just going to call this one just ARY, just so we don't have too many things called to-do array. All right. So first we need to figure out like, so let ul equal document dot get element by ID to-do list. And then we're going to have to iterate over our array and add list items to this as we, what am I thinking? And it's going to be a little bit different depending on the status. Say for so we could say like item in ARY. So I believe when we do a for in loop, item in this case actually refers to the index. We can actually, double check that if we want to. So, and then if we do maybe put this function log at the bottom. Oops, wrong button. Oh, we didn't give it an array. We need to give it the to-do array as an argument. Okay, yeah, so it gave us the index number for using that format. All right, so for index and array, we're going to have to, first off, create an element to store everything. So we can say let list item equal document dot create element. It's going to be a list item. Then we could say li dot inner text is one way we could do it. It's going to equal ARY index, it'd be dot name, I believe. And then we need to say, all right, if it is done, we need to strike through it. So how can we add, so we might say something like if ARY index dot done. So we say true. Yeah, sweet. So we could say is if it equals true, but this putting it just like this is actually kind of amounts to the same thing.
Okay, this is truthiness.
Yeah, truthiness, and it's a Boolean in this case. So if it's not true, it has to be false.
Okay.
So we could say li dot. Let's see what we can do with this. Like li dot style dot. Well, actually, let's look this up. If I do
I was wondering, would we have to do the DL tag as well?
DL tag, what is it?
DL, it actually strikes through. Which means
Yep. So we could add a DL tag. That's one way to do it. I'm also curious if there's like just a JavaScript way of doing that without adding an entire new tag, just because that would save us a few lines. But if not, let's do it that way.
we can add a class and then in our CSS declare that class is straight through.
That's true. So we could also give it a class and then use CSS to strike it through. So there's a lot of different ways to do this, which is one thing that is either awesome or frustrating about front-end development, depending on your point of view. I still want to figure out if there's an answer to my original questions, like style strike through. See if there is a JavaScript DOM method that does that for us. So let's take a look at this. HTML DOM style text decoration. So they have an example document element by ID style text decoration equals underline overline, which is not what we want, but let's see if they have strike through there. Except my browser's being very slow. Come on. So I'm guessing line through will work here. So let's do it this way for now. So where was it? li.style.text decoration equals line through. Make sure I got the syntax correct there. Cool. So I created the list item, set the text to the task's name, and then if the task is done, gave it a line through decoration. Then we could say ul.append child li. So that appends this list item, which we've created but isn't actually in the DOM until we run this method. So whenever we use create element, we're creating a DOM element or a text or a node, whatever you want to call it, and we can manipulate that the same way we would anything in the DOM, but it won't actually show up until we append it to the DOM in some way, like using append child. So now I'm going to go down to the bottom here. I'm going to say to do array equals get to do's, and then I'm going to say render to do's using to do array. So we should see one thing show up. Oh wait, no, we shouldn't, because we should be able to do that either way. So I'm actually going to put this out here and put it after the if else statement. So whether or not there is something or it isn't something, there will always render something. So I look at my to-do list. There it is, add something to the to-do list. It doesn't have a strike through because it's not done. If I take a look at elements here, body, here's my unordered list. The unordered list now has a child, which is an li. Add something to the to-do list. Any questions about how this part has worked? This is all like how we got from this data structure of this to something on the page that all like that process all tracks so far. Okay, cool. All right, so let's just move on to, I want something to happen when I hit the submit button besides refreshing the page. When I type something in here and hit submit, I should get a new thing here, right? So what I'm going to do is first off, I'm going to say, I'm going to make this one a constant because I know it's always going to be the same. So like, to do form equals document.get element by ID. To do form. I'm going to say to do form.add event listener. And the type of event I'm going to listening for is a submit. And then it always takes a function here. So we either define an anonymous function that does this, or we can write a function elsewhere and then call on it here. I think I'm actually going to
I was just going to do the first option.
just write do an anonymous function.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So in this case, it's important that we make sure that, because by default, a submit button refreshes the page. You don't want that to happen. In order to prevent that, our anonymous function is going to have to take event as an argument. So we can event.prevent default. Event.prevent default can be used to prevent a lot of different things, but one of the most common is making sure a form doesn't refresh the page when you submit it. All right, so we prevented the default. If I do this, now it's no longer refreshing the page. So we know that's working. All right, so what are the steps we need to take in order to take an item take something from the form, add it to the list, render the list, and save it to the database, our database? What's the first step? Yeah, we need to get the to-do from the input field. Then what?
It's going to use the helper function which we created earlier to put into the local storage.
So we're going to need to add it to local storage. And we're also going to need to add it to our to-do array variable. Add it to to-do array, and then save to-do array. And then once it's been added to local storage, then we want to make sure we're rendering the updated version, right? Render updated to-do array. All right. So first off, we need to get this. So take a look at it real quick in our HTML here. We have a form, and that form has an input. We didn't give this form input an ID. So that would be one thing we can do in order to get that is we can give this an ID. We can also, there's like, again, so many ways we can organize this. There isn't really one right way. We could also say, use like query selector to get the first input field, which is that one. Only problem with that is there might be more than one input field that might go before that earlier. We don't know. We can also use event.target to essentially start at the form and then go down the way. So does anyone have a preferred method for this? Because it's literally all valid.
I've never seen a event dot. I mean, I don't know. I'm not familiar with event dot target.
Okay, let's take a look at that. And actually, before we do that here, let's do it in the console. Right, no, we can't do that. All right, so event. So actually, I'm gonna console.log event.target here. Did I spell that right? Nope. So now every time I submit this sit button, the target of this event is the ID form. So since the form is the parent element, I should be able to get to this from there by traversing the DOM. So event.target. I believe it's children. Let's try that. So it gives me an HTML collection with 2 inputs. And one is the submit button, one should be the text input. So I do .children 0. Here we go. So using .children, I was able to figure out, okay, I want all of the children of the event, target of this event. One good thing about event.target is that if you have multiple elements that all have like a similar function, that way you don't need to add an event listener to each one. Like you don't need to have different functions for each individual one. You can just say this works for anything that is the target of this event.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah. So now we should be able to say, like, let new task text should be event. Why is this being so laggy? Event target. Wow. Target children 0 value. So I'm going to do a quick console.log just to make sure that is what we're getting, what we think we're getting. Great. All right, so we have our text. So now we want to add it to the to-do array. So we can say to-do array.push. And it's going to take an object where the name is new task text. There we go. And what did I say the thing was? Done? Done is false. So this local variable local variable to this thing is now updated, but now it's ahead of what's actually stored in local storage. So we're gonna have to say, what was it called? Save to-dos. With the new updated to-do array. And in this case, because again, since to-do the local storage is set up like a object, our method overwrites whatever is there. So we don't need to worry about like pushing anything or anything like that. We're just overwriting what's there with this new updated version. All right, so then we need to render the updated to-do array, which we have a method for. Render to-dos with the to-do array. So if I type in, I don't know, what's it? Study? Uh-oh. If I type in sleep. Any ideas of what's happening here?
It's
not
keeping
bad.
it's keeping what it reads and then adding the whole thing plus the new thing.
Yeah. Because if I'm going to take a look at local storage real quick. So we have name is to do thing, name study is done. So we don't have anything here that is nothing here is duplicated, but we didn't tell the DOM to only have these things. It just added these to the things that were already there. So let's update our render to dos, so render to do method, so that it doesn't, so that it kind of clears everything, so we can just only add the new stuff. And a simple way to do that is we could say ul.innerHTML is equal to an empty string. So innerHTML includes essentially everything in between the tags of that element. And by doing so, we're just saying replace all these LIs with an empty string. So every time we eat, sleep, repeat. So we very, very briefly replaced all of these LIs with an empty string and then added LIs to it instead.
Show that in the code one more time. Sorry. I'm sure you're going back there.
Yeah, for the render to do's part, you mean, or the, yeah, so I just added this line right here. Cool. Replacing the inner HTML of this element with an empty string.
So I still don't get how to solve the problem of not repeating the elements every time.
So without this line, what was happening, so my render to do's method takes the entire to-do list and adds a new LI for each thing in that method, each thing in that list, right? And then adds them to this unordered list. But if the unordered list isn't empty, it'll fill it, it'll just add things on to what's already there. So that entire list of add something to the to-do list, study, sleep, repeat, will all get added and then the new element, and then so on and so forth. So what I'm essentially doing is getting rid of these LIs, and then so that there's there's room for my new updated list.
So we just getting rid of it in the list, not in the local storage.
Yeah, so if we take a look at this method we created here. So we added something to our local variable, saved it to local storage, and then used render to do's here. So kind of the balancing act we have to do for this app is making sure that this variable's to-do's array, or to-do array, is always the same as what's in local storage. Because if they're ever, if one is ever ahead of the other, then it's broken. And if I refresh the page, all right, so that all looks good. This is all saved to local storage the way it should be. All right, so it looks like we've got one kind of release of this done, is that we can add things to our list. Next thing we need to do is be able to cross things off the list. Oh, what's another problem? All right. Yeah, we still have this thing there, which is just for practice. We don't want people to accidentally hit enter twice and then have two duplicates. So we can also make sure that when this happens, event.target.children0 value equals an empty string. Now that's gone. So now whenever we click on these things, you should be able to change the status from done from true to false, and change the status from true to false, and then make sure that our local storage version is updated to reflect that. So this is, as you probably know, is the tricky part. So one thing we can do, at least the first thing we can do at least, is we can make sure that every time we render these, we can add the event listener there to make sure to check to see if it happens. So we got all these LIs. So I could say li.append add, not append, add event listener. It's going to take a click event this time. And instead of doing an anonymous function inside my render to-dos, I'm going to define a function here called, cross out. It's going to take event as an argument. Actually, I think we may want to do it this way, like that, because one thing that's kind of tricky about adding callback events, or callbacks in general, is whenever you have these parentheses after a method, when JavaScript reads that, it'll automatically run the method. That's just what it does. It's designed to do it. By essentially defining an anonymous arrow function and telling that anonymous arrow function, your job is to call on this other function, we're wrapping that in a layer of abstraction so that this function right here, cross out, which we haven't written yet, won't run until the event happens. So let's write out cross out now. In this case, there isn't really a default to prevent, so I don't think we need to do do that, but we do need to know which element we're doing, so we can say let li equal event.target. And let's just make sure it works, console.log li here, to make sure that when we click on each of these things, we should be able to console.log the thing we clicked on. So we got that, So each of these have their own event listener telling it to only, that works differently for each of them because each of them has their own unique event.target. Is that kind of how that happened? Does that scan? Because I know that's kind of can be a tricky thing sometimes.
If you applied that event listener to just the unordered list, would anything you clicked in that unordered list then or it would just return all the list items?
Yes, it would. So one thing about event listeners is there's a word specific, bubbling is what it's called. So when you put an event listener on a item, it also is going to be listening for every single item that it's a child of, and they kind of bubble up. So we could also add this to the unordered list. It would kind of amount to the same effect. Generally speaking, bubbling can be dangerous because if you have something that's a child of this element that you add an event listener to that you aren't expecting, then something might go wrong. So the reason I'm adding this event listener to each individual LI instead of the unordered list as a whole is so that way I'll make sure that it only ever targets the LIs, nothing that accidentally gets added to the unordered list as a child. Like if for some reason I put a button there, I don't want to delete the button. Does that answer your question?
It does, thank you.
Awesome. Cool. All right, so now we need to decide, all right, we need to so we need to update our list. We click on something to change it, to figure out, is this already done? And if it is done, we need to change it to something else. The question is, so we have this, what's it called, to-do array. How do we find the correct item in this list based on what we clicked on? So I remember somebody mentioned that by putting it into an array, each of these have their own, each of these have an index number. So what if we could store in our HTML element which index number it is? So that way we can say just retrieve the index number from event.target. One way we can do that, there's a lot of different ways to do that. One way we can do that is with a tool called dataset. So do CSS dataset. Let's see. Using data attributes. Let's see what that's. So HTML syntax here is simple. So we can give these tags something called data-columns equal to 3, or data index number equal to this, data parent. So, and then to access it through the DOM, we can use the dataset.columns equals that. So this is essentially a way of storing information in a DOM element without making it part of its ID or class or something like that. So if I want to make sure that when we render these, we always give it the index, I can, again, update my render to-dos method. I can find it. So many things now. Render to-dos, where'd you go? There we go. So we could also say li.dataset.indexNum equals index. So now if I look at this, expect each element in my ordered list. Now it says data index num equals 0. So that when we click on them, we should be able to access which number it is without worrying about having to, worry about searching through our array for the thing with the name that is equal to this, because that's a bit of a pain. So data sets can be very useful for stuff like this, but just be careful, because when you do that, the user can also see that. So don't put anything in the data set that you don't want to expose to the user.
What is open not when exposed?
Fine. Let me think of a good example. Like a crazy example off the top of my head, and this is something that I don't think you would even want to do, but if for some reason you had a list of users and you want to say, when I click on a user, I want to access that user's password, you don't want to save that password as part of the data set, because that would be horrible practice in that case. So just keep in mind that whatever you save to the data set will be visible to the user. But now that we have this in there, we can just say, all right, we can just retrieve it based on what we clicked on. So now you can find crossout. So I could say, let index num, in this case, is going to be equal li.dataset.indexNum. And then we need to say, all right, we have our to-do array, indexNum dot done. Actually, it's going to be different depending on if it's. So we could either make it so that you can either cross it out or uncross it out, or we could just say once it's crossed out, it's crossed out. It didn't tell us one way or the other. What do we think?
Should be able to uncross it out.
Sure. So in that case, it's actually a lot easier, because then we could just say equals not to do array index num dot done. So if it's true, we'll set it to false. If it's false, we'll set it to true. Then we need to save our to-dos and then render them again. All right, let's see if this works. So we can do that. If I refresh the page, it still says crossed out. So I can cross them all out, refresh the page, they're still there, uncross them out, refresh the page, they're still there. Yeah, so this the data structure we picked here is actually perfect for this kind of thing in that case. Yeah, the only problem is right now we don't have a way of removing something permanently, but that wasn't in the README, so I'm not going to worry about it. All right, cool. So that was about almost exactly an hour. Perfect. Does anyone have any other? I know this was a lot. I'll push this solution to GitHub so you all can look at it later, because I know this was a whole lot of information and of doing this. Does anyone have any pressing questions about this solution? Which is this the best solution? Not necessarily, because it all depends on this kind of global variable here, which isn't really something you should do, but it works. Any questions about how this has happened?
I think this is a perfect example of single responsibility, like functions or principle. Because if we try to like tackle this problem head on, you get nowhere. But like if you just separate out start function.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Yeah, so as we get into more things that have to deal with event listeners and stuff like that, the more you can break things up by single responsibility, the easier your life will be. Just because having these save to-dos and get to-dos and render to-dos functions made our lives so much easier, because we can just call on them whenever something changed. Where did the there's get to-dos. So these are two very simple functions. So they're like 2 or 3 lines each. But they just are just something that says automatically do this when this happens. Okay, great. So let's come back at 11:05, so in about 12 minutes, and we'll talk about data science.
Good question.
Yeah, one sec.